Welcome, I'm Jeremy. I've got a story for you. One that takes us to a rotting seaside town where the mist hides more than it shows. Let's step into the world. The fog rolled into the seaside town like a tide, so thick it swallowed everything, silencing the birds that once called from the cliffs and stopping the clocks in their rusted frames. It crept down cobblestone streets, curling through cracked windows and slipping down chimneys, heavy enough to make the air taste of salt and decay. Boats vanished from the harbor overnight, their ropes left dangling in the water, and the townspeople whispered that the fog took them, though no one dared say to where. Children were taught to keep their windows shut, to never touch the mist when it pressed against the glass, and above all, to never speak to the figures that stood inside it. Their shapes blurred, but always watching. A girl lived on the edge of town, where the cliffs dropped sharp into the sea and the fog was thickest. Her home was a single upright barrel, weathered and barnacle-crusted, perched on a ledge where the waves hissed below. It wasn't a house made of barrels, just one, barely big enough to hold her, its wood stained dark by years of salt and mist. Every morning, she'd pull her knees to her chest, pop the lid with a creak, and crawl out like a seed from a pod, her movements slow and deliberate. Her coat was made of kelp, woven tight and glistening wet, trailing behind her like a shadow. Her teeth were too sharp, catching the faint light, and her age was a mystery. No one could say if she was young or old, only that she'd always been there, as much a part of the town as the fog itself. The townspeople pretended not to see her as she moved through the streets, her bare feet leaving damp prints on the cobblestones. They turned their heads when she passed, their hands tightening on their coats, their voices falling silent. She pretended too, pretended not to see the ghosts on their roofs, their shapes pale and shifting, their eyes following her like they knew something she didn't. She kept her head down, her kelp coat rustling, and climbed the hills where the fog gathered like a feast. She was hungry, always hungry. She didn't eat food. It made her nose bleed, bright red against her pale skin. She didn't drink water. It made her bones ache, a deep, hollow pain that kept her awake for days. What she ate was fog. She'd stand on the hill, the mist so thick it hid the sea below, and part her lips, breathing it in like a meal. The fog went willingly, melting into her, swirling down her throat like soup, cold and heavy. It filled her, warmed her in a way nothing else could. And as she ate, she heard things, echoes trapped in the mist, memories that weren't hers. A voice whispering in German, sharp and pleading. A broken violin note, high and mournful. The wet cough of someone dying in 1926, the sound so clear she could almost smell the damp room it came from. She ate their echoes, their memories, and they became part of her, changing her in ways she couldn't name. Her eyes grew brighter, her skin paler, and sometimes, when she spoke, her voice sounded like it carried another's whisper beneath it. The townspeople watched her from their windows, their faces tight with fear, but they never spoke to her. They knew what she did on the hill, and they knew what the fog carried. They just hoped it would never come for them. The fog clung to the seaside town like a shroud, so dense it seemed to press down on the cobblestone streets, muting the world beneath its weight. It seeped through the cracks of shuttered windows, wrapped around the rusted weather vanes and hung heavy in the air, tasting of salt and something older, something forgotten. The harbor stood empty, its docks slick with mist, the ropes that once held boats now trailing into the water like loose threads. On the cliffs above, the wind barely stirred, and the ghosts on the rooftops stood still, their shapes faint but ever present, their eyes fixed on the girl who walked through the streets below. She moved with purpose, her kelp coat trailing behind her, the woven strands glistening wet against the cobblestones. Her barrel sat perched on the cliff's edge, its lid closed tight, the barnacles on its side catching the faint light that managed to pierce the fog. She didn't look back as she climbed the hill, her bare feet steady on the slick grass, her sharp teeth glinting when she parted her lips. The townspeople watched from behind their curtains, their breaths held, their hands gripping the edges of their coats. They knew where she was going, and they knew what she'd do when she got there. The hill rose steep and jagged, its top swallowed by the thickest part of the fog, a place where the air felt alive, heavy with whispers no one else could hear. She stopped at the crest, her coat settling around her like a wave, and tilted her head back, letting the mist curl toward her. It came willingly, as it always did, drawn to her like water to a drain, swirling into her open mouth and down her throat. The fog tasted cold, sharp like the sea after a storm, and it filled her, easing the hunger that gnawed at her bones. She closed her eyes, her hands unclenching at her sides, and listened as the echoes came. A voice in German, softer this time, like a mother calling a child home. A violin note, broken and sharp, cutting through the silence. The cough again, wet and ragged, from a room in 1926 where the walls were damp with grief. The memories flooded her, sharp and vivid, and she let them settle inside her, becoming part of her in ways she couldn't untangle. Her skin prickled, her eyes burned, and her voice, when she hummed softly to herself, carried the faint echo of someone else's song. But that night, the fog brought something different. Not a voice, not a sound, but a shape. It formed slowly, the mist parting just enough to reveal a boy, barefoot and hollow-eyed, his skin pale as the moon. He wasn't entirely real. His edges shimmered. His feet barely touched the grass, but he was there, standing in front of her on the hill, his gaze fixed on her with a quiet intensity. She stopped eating, the fog still swirling around her lips, and stared at him, her sharp teeth catching the faint light. "Stop eating it," he said, his voice soft but clear, cutting through the muffled stillness. "Please." She tilted her head, her kelp coat rustling, the mist still clinging to her like a second skin. "Why?" she asked, her voice low, carrying that strange layered whisper that wasn't entirely hers. The boy stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the grass, and lifted his shirt. His chest was hollow, a gaping void where his heart should have been, the edges of his skin fraying into the fog. "You're eating me," he said, his hollow eyes unblinking, his voice trembling with something that sounded like fear. Or maybe it was hope. She froze, the fog still heavy on her tongue, her hunger a sharp ache in her jaw. The mist around them seemed to still, the whispers fading, the ghosts on the rooftops below turning their heads as if they could hear the boy's words. She looked at him, at the hollow space where he should have been whole, and felt something shift inside her. A memory that wasn't hers, a grief that wasn't her own. The fog hung heavy on the hill, a thick curtain that wrapped the seaside town in silence, its edges curling like fingers around the jagged cliffs below. The cobblestone streets were slick with mist, reflecting nothing but gray, and the harbor's empty docks glistened, the ropes trailing into the water like forgotten promises. The ghosts on the rooftops stood motionless, their pale shapes barely visible, their eyes fixed on the hill where the girl stood, her kelp coat shimmering wet in the faint light. The barrel on the cliff's edge sat closed, its barnacles catching the mist, a silent sentinel over the sea that whispered far below. She stood frozen, the boy's words echoing in her ears, his hollow eyes staring into hers. The fog still clung to her lips, cold and heavy, its taste sharp like the sea after a storm. Her hunger gnawed at her, a deep, aching thing that made her fingers twitch, her jaw throb, her sharp teeth itch against her gums. The mist swirled around her, waiting, as if it knew she couldn't resist for long. The boy stood closer now, his barefoot steps silent, his shimmering form fraying at the edges where the fog touched him. His shirt was still lifted, the hollow space in his chest a void that seemed to pull at the air, a dark emptiness where life should have been. "You're eating me," he'd said, and the words lingered, heavy as the mist itself. She looked at him, her eyes bright with something that wasn't quite hers, her skin pale as the moon. The hunger roared inside her, louder now, a beast that wouldn't be ignored. But she clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, and tried to stop. She pressed her lips together, turning her head away from the fog, her kelp coat rustling as she took a step back. The boy watched her, his hollow eyes softening, a flicker of hope in his shimmering form. But the hunger wouldn't let go. It grew, clawing at her throat, a desperate, aching need that made her bones feel hollow, her skin too tight. Her fingers twitched again, her jaw ached, and her teeth, those sharp, glinting teeth, itched so fiercely she could taste blood. She tried to hold her breath, to push the fog away, but it pressed closer, curling around her like a lover, whispering its own need to be eaten. The echoes in the mist stirred again. A German voice, a violin note, that wet cough from 1926. But this time, they were drowned out by something louder, something closer. The boy's memories. They came in a flood, sharp and vivid, as the fog slipped past her lips despite her clenched jaw. She couldn't stop it. She parted her lips just a fraction, and the mist poured in, swirling down her throat like a river breaking through a dam. The hunger sighed, sated for a moment, but the boy's memories filled her, painting pictures she hadn't asked to see. A hallway lined with jars, their glass clouded with age, each one holding a wisp of fog that shimmered like a trapped star. A mother with needle and thread, sewing fog into the hems of her dresses, her hands trembling as she whispered to the mist like it could hear her. A lighthouse on the cliff, its lantern dark, its stone walls slick with salt. A place where no light ever shone but where the fog gathered thickest, hiding something, or someone, inside. The boy's form flickered, his hollow chest fraying further, his edges dissolving into the mist as she ate. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes stayed on her, hollow and pleading until the last of him shimmered away, swallowed by the fog she couldn't stop eating. She felt him settle inside her, his memories mixing with the others, his grief and hope now hers to carry. The fog on the hill thinned just a little as she lowered her head, her kelp coat heavy around her shoulders. Her hunger was quiet now, but something else stirred. A weight, a fullness that wasn't there before. The ghosts on the rooftops below turned away, their shapes fading, and the town held its breath, waiting for what came next. The fog on the hill seemed to shudder as the last of the boy dissolved into it, his shimmering form now just a memory inside her, heavy and cold like the mist itself. The seaside town below lay silent, its cobblestone streets slick with the remnants of the night's mist. The harbor's empty docks reflecting nothing but gray. The ghosts on the rooftops were gone. Their pale shapes vanished as if they'd never been, and the air felt emptier. The weight of their watching lifted. The girl stood alone on the hill, her kelp coat clinging to her shoulders, its woven strands dripping with condensation, her sharp teeth glinting as she exhaled a shaky breath. The hunger was gone, sated for the first time she could remember, but it left behind a fullness that pressed against her ribs, a strange, layered feeling that wasn't entirely hers. The boy's memories swirled inside her, vivid and sharp, a hallway lined with jars, a mother sewing fog into dresses, a lighthouse where no light ever shone. She could still see his hollow eyes, feel the tremor in his voice when he'd said, "You're eating me." Her fingers unclenched, her hands trembling as she touched her lips, the taste of the fog still lingering, cold and salty, now mixed with something new, grief, hope, a longing for a light that never came. She turned her head, looking down at the town below, where the mist had thinned just enough to reveal the outlines of the rotting buildings, their shingles curling like dead leaves. The barrel on the cliff's edge stood as it always had, its lid closed, its barnacles glistening wet. But it felt different now. Smaller, less like a home and more like a shell she'd outgrown. Her skin prickled, colder than it should have been, and her eyes burned, not with hunger, but with something else. Something that felt like rain waiting to fall. She took a step down the hill, her bare feet slipping on the wet grass, and the fog followed her, trailing behind like a shadow. Thinner, but still alive. The townspeople, hidden behind their shuttered windows, felt the change before they saw it. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight of the fog lifting, and for the first time in years they could hear the faint hiss of the waves below the cliffs, a sound the mist had always muffled. They pressed their faces to the glass, their breaths fogging the panes, and watched as the girl descended the hill, her kelp coat trailing, her movements slower than usual, as if she carried something heavier than herself. She didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the eyes that followed her, but she felt their stares, sharp as the wind that now stirred the thinning mist. The boy's memories pulsed inside her, mixing with the others, the German voice, the violin note, the cough from 1926, until they became a chorus, a layered hum that vibrated in her chest. She stopped at the edge of the town, her feet on the cobblestones, and looked toward the sea, where the horizon was just visible, a faint line of gray against the fading fog. The seaside town exhaled as the fog continued to thin, revealing the rotting wooden frames of houses, their paint peeled away like old skin, and the harbor's docks where the water lapped gently at the empty spaces left by vanished boats. The cobblestone streets glistened, the mist's remnants pooling in the cracks, and the air carried a new sound. The soft crash of waves against the cliffs, unmuted for the first time in years. The barrel on the cliff's edge stood alone, its lid still closed, its barnacles catching the faint light of a dawn that was clearer than any the town had seen in memory. The girl stood at the edge of the town, her kelp coat heavy with dew, its strands trailing across the cobblestones like seaweed caught in a tide. Her sharp teeth were hidden now, her lips pressed together, but her eyes, those bright, burning eyes, were full of something new, something that shimmered like rain on glass. The boy's memories still hummed inside her, a quiet chorus joined by the others she'd eaten over the years, their voices weaving together in a song she couldn't quite understand. The hallway lined with jars, the mother sewing fog into dresses, the lighthouse with its dark lantern. They were hers now, as much a part of her as the hunger had been. She felt different, changed in a way she couldn't name. Her skin was colder, paler, almost translucent, and her movements were slower, as if the weight of the memories had settled into her bones. The hunger was gone, but in its place was a fullness, a strange, layered presence that made her feel both more and less herself. She lifted a hand, watching as her fingers trembled, the tips of them fading slightly into the thinning mist, as if she were becoming part of it. The thought didn't scare her. It felt right, like a tide pulling her back to the sea. A child's voice broke the silence, small and hesitant, from a doorway nearby. "Where did the fog go?" the boy asked, his eyes wide, his hands clutching the edge of his coat. He was braver than most, stepping out onto the cobblestones, his bare feet pale against the dark stone. The girl turned to him, her kelp coat rustling, and her eyes met his, shimmering with that rain-like glow. She didn't answer right away, her gaze drifting back to the sea, where the horizon was clearer now, the gray water stretching endless and calm. The townspeople watched from their windows, their faces pale, their breaths held. They could feel the change in the air, the way the mist had retreated, leaving the town bare and exposed. The ghosts were gone, the clocks were ticking again, and the birds, those long silent birds, began to call faintly from the cliffs, their voices sharp in the stillness. The girl stood there, a silhouette against the dawn, her presence both haunting and calm, like the sea after a storm. The dawn broke over the seaside town, its light soft but clear, cutting through the last wisps of fog that clung to the cobblestone streets. The harbor's docks stood empty, the water lapping gently at the ropes that trailed into the sea, and the rotting houses looked smaller somehow, their shingles less heavy, their windows catching the light in a way they hadn't for years. The barrel on the cliff's edge creaked as the lid popped open, its sound echoing faintly across the town, and the girl emerged, her movements slower than ever, her kelp coat glistening with the morning dew. She crawled out like a seed from a pod, but she was different now. Her skin was pale as mist, almost translucent, and her eyes were full of rain shimmering with a light that seemed to come from within. When she stood, her bare feet steady on the cliff's edge, her voice came out in a whisper, but it sounded like three voices speaking together. A German plea, a violin note, and the boy's quiet hope, all woven into her own. The townspeople, gathered at the edge of the town now, watched her with wide eyes, their hands clutching their coats, their breaths fogging the air. The birds on the cliffs called louder now, their songs sharp and clear, and the clocks in the houses ticked in time. A rhythm the town hadn't heard in decades. The same child who'd spoken before stepped forward, braver than the rest, his small face pale but curious. "What happened to the boy in the fog?" he asked, his voice trembling just a little, his eyes fixed on the girl's shimmering gaze. She looked down at him, her kelp coat rustling softly, and a smile curved her lips, small and strange, her sharp teeth catching the dawn light. "He lives in me now," she said, her voice a haunting chorus, the layered whispers echoing across the cobblestones. "I keep him safe." The townspeople shifted uneasily, their murmurs low, but they didn't turn away. The girl leaned down, her pale hand brushing the air in front of the child, and exhaled. Her breath came out as fog, soft and white, curling from her lips like a living thing. It drifted down the cobblestone streets, slow at first, then faster, spreading through the town like a tide. But this fog was different. It was lighter, warmer, carrying the faint hum of the boy's hope, the mother's whispers, the lighthouse's silence. The townspeople stepped back, but they didn't run, their eyes wide as the new fog wrapped around their homes, gentle and alive. The girl straightened, her kelp coat shimmering, her rain-filled eyes fixed on the sea. She wasn't hungry anymore, but she was something else now, something more than she'd been, a keeper of echoes, a vessel for the fog's memories. The town watched her walk back to her barrel, her steps silent, her form fading slightly into the mist she'd exhaled, as if she were becoming part of it. The new fog spread through the seaside town, its tendrils soft and warm, carrying the echoes of the girl's memories, the boy's hope, the mother's whispers, the lighthouse's dark silence. It curled around the cobblestone streets, brushing against the rotting houses, slipping through the cracks in the shutters, but it didn't silence the birds or stop the clocks. The harbor's docks remained empty, the water lapping gently at the ropes, but the air felt lighter, the town less heavy, as if it had been cleansed of its ghosts. The birds sang from the cliffs, their voices a quiet melody, and the dawn light grew brighter, casting long shadows across the town. The girl climbed back into her barrel, her kelp coat trailing behind her, its strands catching on the barnacles as she pulled the lid shut. She curled up inside, her knees to her chest, her rain-filled eyes closing, and for the first time she felt full. Not with hunger, but with purpose. The boy lived in her now, his memories safe inside her, along with the others she'd eaten over the years. She was their keeper, their voice, and the fog she exhaled would carry them through the town, a gentle reminder of what had been. The townspeople watched the fog spread, their faces softer now, their fear replaced with something closer to wonder. The children played in the streets again, their laughter mingling with the birdsong, and the clocks kept ticking, their rhythm steady. The girl in the barrel slept, her breath slow and even, and the fog she'd made drifted on, a new kind of mist. One that didn't take, but gave.